If you walk through the cast-iron districts of Soho in New York, the historic centers of London, or the forgotten industrial hubs of Chicago, you will inevitably step over them. Small purple-tinted glass studs embedded in the concrete. Thousands of tiny, translucent portholes arranged in a perfect geometric grid. The official architectural narrative, the one found in standard city heritage plaques, tells us these are vault lights. We are told that in the mid-19th century, before the widespread adoption of the Edison bulb, these glass blocks were a clever way to provide passive illumination to the storage basements beneath the sidewalk. They call it a Victorian skylight. That is the safe story. It is logical. It is practical. And if you look at the physics of these glass structures, it is a massive, calculated distraction from a much darker reality. Because when you look at the underside of these glass blocks, the public was never meant to see. You aren't looking at flat window glass. You are looking at prisms. These aren't just letting light in. They are bending it. They are directing a high-intensity light cannon deep into the subterranean levels of the city. But here's the question the history books refuse to answer. Why would a simple storage basement or a coal cellar require the precision of Fresnel lens technology? Why would the architects of the 1860s men like Thaddeus Hyatt spend millions of dollars in 19th century currency to install Luxfer prisms that were capable of lighting a space 50 feet deep? The truth is that these weren't basements. They were the original ground floors. When you stand on a modern sidewalk, you aren't standing on the foundation of the city. You are standing on a capping layer. Underneath your feet is a world that was buried in a single coordinated effort between 1850 and 1900. A world of high ceilings, ornate masonry, and grand entrances that now sit in the dark beneath the sewer lines. The glass in the sidewalk wasn't a new invention for basements. It was the life support system for a city that had been forcibly moved underground. The vault lights were the last windows of a civilization that was being paved over in real time. And the reason we call them basements today is so you don't ask why the real city is 10 feet below the mud. To understand the glass in the sidewalk, you have to understand the event they call the raising of the grade. In the 1850s and 60s, cities across the Western world from Chicago to Seattle to London underwent a massive, impossible engineering feat. They lifted the streets. The official reason given by historians is drainage and sewerage. They claim the mud was so bad that the city leaders decided to jack up thousands of tons of brick and stone buildings to install pipes underneath. Consider the scale of that claim. In Chicago, they used thousands of screw jacks to lift entire city blocks, hotels, theaters, and homes, while people were still inside eating dinner. They claim this was done for muddy streets, but if you look at the photos of the era, the original ground floors were already built with massive arched windows and professional storefronts. You don't build a grand 15-foot high arched entrance into a mud pit. The truth is more disturbing. The raising wasn't a choice. It was a concealment. As the streets were raised, the original first floors became the new basements. This created a massive, dark, void space beneath the new sidewalks. The city leaders didn't want to lose the real estate, but they couldn't run gas lines or kerosene lamps into these thousands of miles of new underworld without risking a global explosion. They needed a way to keep the undercity functional without using fire. Enter the Luxfer prism. This wasn't just glass, it was an advanced optical system. By using a specific sawtooth prism design, these glass studs could take a single ray of afternoon sun and throw it horizontally across a room. This allowed the buried floors to remain as factories, offices, and even luxury barbershops hidden beneath the feet of the new world. The glass sidewalks were the optical fiber of the 19th century. They were the only thing preventing the buried city from becoming a tomb. But why would a civilization choose to bury its most beautiful architecture and then spend a fortune lighting it from above? They didn't choose it. They were hiding the evidence of the previous foundation. The cities we live in aren't ours. They are inherited assets that we have been taught to call Victorian. If you look closely at these sidewalk lights today, you'll notice that many of them have turned a deep, ghostly shade of amethyst or purple. Modern tour guides will tell you this is a chemical accident. They say that the original glass contained manganese as a decolorizing agent, and that decades of exposure to ultraviolet sunlight caused a chemical reaction called solarization, turning the glass purple. Again, this is the chemical explanation for an optical crime. In the world of spectroscopy, purple light, the violet end of the spectrum, carries the highest frequency and the highest energy. Manganese was not added to clear the glass, it was added to shift the light. The architects of the buried city understood atmospheric optics better than we do today. They knew that the undercity was prone to dampness, mold, and stagnant ether. By shifting the incoming sunlight into the violet and ultraviolet spectrum, they were effectively disinfecting the buried floors. The purple glass acted as a massive, city-wide UV sterilization system. It kept the buried workforce healthy in a world without fresh air. But there is a secondary effect. High-frequency violet light has a specific effect on human psychology and the pineal gland. It keeps the brain in a state of high alert. By lighting the underground factories with solarized violet light, the industrial titans of the 1800s were able to keep their workers active for longer hours without the fatigue that comes from standard yellow light. These purple studs are the fingerprints of a high science society. They were using quantum frequency shifting before the word quantum was ever in a textbook. When you walk over a purple glass tile, you aren't looking at old glass, you are looking at a Tude filter. You are looking at the remains of a system that treated light as a nutrient, a disinfectant, and a tool of control. The glass didn't just light the floor, it conditioned the people living below. And the fact that we've forgotten how these prisms work is the greatest proof that our modern science is actually a regression. We're walking on top of a high-frequency civilization, and we call it trash. When the cities were raised, the elites didn't just lose the ground floor, they gained a shadow dimension. To understand the glass in the sidewalk, you have to stop looking at the glass and start looking at the void beneath it. In cities like Seattle and Chicago, the Pioneer Square and the Loop districts weren't just lifted, they were doubled. As the new street level was constructed on massive iron girders and brick arches, a secondary world emerged. This wasn't a basement in the modern sense. These were 15 to 20 foot high corridors of commerce. The Luxor Prism was the only thing that allowed this secondary economy to exist. These vault lights were so efficient that in 1890 a jeweler could sit 30 feet back from the sidewalk and have enough high-quality, white-balanced light to grade diamonds. Think about the physics required for that. To move sunlight through a 4-inch hole in a sidewalk and maintain enough luminous flux to perform precision jewelry work 30 feet underground. This suggests that the glass used in these prisms wasn't just glass, it was a high-purity optical-grade crystal, potentially doped with rare earth elements that have since been removed from the public record. Why would the city leaders go to such lengths? Because the undercity was the real engine of the 19th century. While the polite society walked on the new elevated sidewalks, the heavy industry, the high-stakes gambling dens, the massive printing presses, and the steam-powered pneumatic tube systems, the internet of the 1800s, were all humming away in the violet light of the underworld. But there is a darker theory. If you look at the architectural plans of these raised cities, you see that the original entrances to these buildings were often more ornate, more fortified, and more significant than the new entrances built on the upper floors. It's as if the new city was a temporary wooden stage built over a permanent ancient stone foundation. The glass in the sidewalk wasn't a luxury, it was a life support system for a workforce that was never supposed to see the real sun again. It was the birth of the hive mind architecture, and when the cities finally transitioned to electricity, they didn't just update the lights, they sealed the tunnels. They filled the undercity with concrete and debris, burying the original storefronts and the Luxor prisms, turning the high technology of the 1880s into a forgotten basement that we now ignore as we walk to work. Here is the part of the story that the prison glass manufacturers don't want you to calculate. If we look at the placement of vault lights, they are almost always located near the structural ironwork of the building. In the late 1800s, there was a fringe science known as terrestrial magnetism. Scientists like Lord Kelvin and Nikola Tesla were exploring the idea that the Earth's atmosphere was a massive pressurized electrical capacitor. They believed that light wasn't just waves, it was a carrier signal for energy. The Lux-Fair prisms, with their specific manganese-rich composition and sawtooth geometry, may have served a dual purpose. By concentrating high-frequency violet light into the iron-framed basements, they were creating a photoelectric effect on a massive scale. The Undercity wasn't just being lit, it was being energized. The purple glass acted as a solid-state frequency converter. It took the broad-spectrum white light of the sun and narrowed it into the ultraviolet range. When this UV light hit the zinc-coated iron and brass fixtures of the 19th century machinery below, it released electrons. The glass sidewalks were, in effect, a passive solar power plant. They were harvesting the high-energy end of the solar spectrum to maintain the vitality of the subterranean levels. This explains why the Victorian era had such a bizarre obsession with sanatoriums and light therapy. They understood that light was a nutrient, but when the electric monopoly took over in the early 20th century, this free energy system had to be erased. The Luxfer Prison Company was systematically bought out and shut down. The violet glass was replaced by dead green glass or opaque concrete. The history was rewritten to say that these prisms were just clumsy Victorian windows. The real reason for the glass in the sidewalk is that our ancestors were living in a high-frequency civilization. They were using the very ground beneath their feet to generate health, light, and power. And we have been taught to walk over those purple eyes and see nothing but an old sidewalk. The truth isn't just under your feet. It's glowing in the ultraviolet, and once you see the prism, you realize the basement was actually the power plant. By 1910, the violet era was being systematically dismantled. If you look at the municipal records of major cities like New York, London, and San Francisco from this period, you see a strange pattern of infrastructure updates that don't quite add up. Massive sections of the subterranean corridors, the ones lit by the Luxfer prisms, were suddenly declared structurally unsound or fire hazards. But the structural integrity wasn't the problem. The problem was the autonomy. A city that is lit by the sun, even in its basements, is a city that is difficult to meter. A business that operates 20 feet below the street using passive atmospheric optics doesn't need to pay for the new light, the Edison bulb, and the massive coal-fired power plants that were being erected on the outskirts of every metropolis. The Luxor prison was more than a window. It was a competitor to the electric grid. This is why the Great Erasure began. Between 1915 and 1940, millions of these glass studs were physically smashed or covered with layers of asphalt. In many cities, the subterranean storefronts were walled off with cinder blocks. The original arched windows, some of them 15 feet tall and made of high-quality cast iron, were filled with rubble and dirt. The buried floor was redefined. It was no longer a place of commerce. It was rebranded as a dark basement. The history books began to describe the mid-19th century as a dark and smoky era, ignoring the fact that the architecture of that time was specifically designed to be the most light-filled in human history. Why the smear campaign? Because to justify the modern world, you have to make the old world look primitive. If the public realized that their grandfathers were using optical-grade frequency shifters to light their offices with free, sterilized solar energy, they would start asking why they were now paying a monthly bill for a flickering yellow, low-frequency tungsten bulb. The glass in the sidewalk had to be forgotten. It had to be turned into a quirky Victorian antique. The hive was sealed, and the population was moved into the box. We are now living in the aftermath of the Great Elevation. When you step on one of the surviving purple glass studs today, you are making contact with the capped well. Modern urban planners call these dead spaces. They're the voids beneath the sidewalks that are now used for fiber optic cables, gas mains, and steam pipes. But look at the irony of the technology. Today we move information through glass fibers using pulses of light. We call it cutting edge. Our ancestors were doing the exact same thing on a macro scale. They were moving high-frequency data in the form of sunlight through glass blocks to power the processors, the humans and machines in the floors below. The Luxfer prism was a macro fiber optic. It was a system that understood that light is the primary currency of life. When we replaced these prisms with concrete, we didn't just lose a window, we lost our circadian infrastructure. Modern humans spend 90% of their time under artificial, high-flicker LED and fluorescent lighting. This low-quality light is the opposite of the violet-shifted solar light that the vault lights provided. The result? The modern shadow, chronic fatigue, vitamin D deficiency, and a disconnect from the Earth's natural rhythms. We are living in a basement of our own making, even when we are on the top floor of a skyscraper. The real reason old buildings have glass in the sidewalk is that they were built by a civilization that refused to live in the dark. They understood that to bury a flaw was not to kill it, but to protect it, provided you had the optical keys to keep the light flowing. Every purple stud you see is a reminder that the city is deeper than you were told. The storefronts are still down there. The arches are still down there. The high-frequency history of humanity is waiting, just 10 feet below the asphalt, preserved in the cold dark, lit only by the occasional stray ray of sun that managed to find a crack in the modern lie. The next time you walk over the glass, don't just see a sidewalk, see a battery, see a watchman, see the last evidence of a world that was too bright to be forgotten, even if they had to bury it to try. The city isn't built on rock. It's built on the light of the people they tried to hide.